The morning air in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, carried the scent of creosote and dust as Staff Sergeant James Windtalker stood before Colonel Harrison's desk, his calloused hands clasped behind his back. The year was 1943, and the war in Europe demanded every advantage America could muster. James was different from most soldiers on the base. His grandfather had taught him the old ways, the Apache knowledge passed down through generations about reading the sun, the stars, and the land itself. At 32, he carried both worlds within him, the ancient wisdom of his people and the modern warfare training of the United States Army. The colonel's office was sparse, decorated only with maps of European terrain and a photograph of General Patton. Harrison was a Texas man, built like a water tower, with a mustache that drooped past his jawline. He looked at James with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "You wanted to see me, sir?" James asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. Harrison pushed a leather-bound notebook across the desk. Inside were pages filled with calculations, diagrams showing sun trajectories, angles of light refraction, and tactical positioning based on celestial movement. James had spent 6 months developing what he called the sun angle calculator, a method of predicting exactly when and where the sun would create maximum visibility advantage or disadvantage on a battlefield. "This," Harrison said, tapping the notebook with his index finger, "is being confiscated. Effective immediately." James felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, that calculator could save American lives. I've proven it works in every simulation we've run." The colonel stood, walking to the window that overlooked the training grounds where young men practiced maneuvers in the relentless Arizona heat. "I don't doubt your calculations, Sergeant. I doubt whether command will trust tactics that sound like," and he paused, choosing his words carefully, "like mysticism rather than military science. This mathematics, sir. Pure geometry and astronomy. My grandfather taught me to track the sun before I could write my own name, but I've verified every calculation with standard artillery tables and astronomical charts." Harrison turned back, his expression softening slightly. "The Pentagon doesn't see it that way. They see an Apache using," and here he made air quotes with his fingers, "ancient tribal knowledge to dictate modern warfare strategy. They're calling it unreliable, unscientific." James felt the familiar sting of discrimination, the same feeling he'd encountered growing up on the reservation when white teachers dismissed his culture as primitive superstition. But this was different. This was about men dying because bureaucrats couldn't see past their prejudice. "How many simulations did we run, sir?" James asked quietly. 15. "And how many times did my positioning predictions prove accurate?" Harrison looked away. "All 15. The silence stretched between them like a canyon. Outside, a bugle called soldiers to formation, the sound sharp and lonely in the desert morning. "I'm shipping out to North Africa next week," James said. "Then probably Italy or France after that. Will I be allowed to use my own knowledge to keep my men alive? Or is that banned too?" The colonel's face reddened. "Don't be insubordinate, Sergeant." "I'm not, sir. I'm asking a direct question. If I see an opportunity to position our guns where the sun will blind the enemy at dawn, am I permitted to take it? Or do I need written authorization from men who've never set foot on a battlefield?" Harrison sat back down heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 48 years. "Your calculator is officially banned from military planning. What you do in the field, in the moment, under combat conditions," he paused meaningfully, "that's tactical discretion. Every sergeant has it." James understood. The colonel was giving him permission in the only way he could without directly defying orders. "Thank you, sir." As James turned to leave, Harrison called out, "Windtalker?" His voice had changed, softer now, almost paternal. "Bring those boys home. However you need to do it." James nodded once and left the office, the Arizona sun beating down on his shoulders as he crossed the parade ground. In his mind, he was already calculating angles, remembering his grandfather's lessons about how the sun moved differently in European latitudes, how morning light in France would strike the land at angles foreign to these desert mountains. 3 other Apache men from his unit sat on the barrack steps, polishing boots and cleaning rifles. They looked up as he approached. "They took it?" asked Tommy Redhorse, James's childhood friend from the reservation. James sat down beside them, pulling out his own rifle to clean. They took the notebook. But they can't take what's in here. He tapped his temple, or what grandfather taught us here. He placed his hand over his heart. The four men continued their work in comfortable silence, each knowing that soon they'd be across an ocean, fighting a war where every advantage, no matter how small or how old, might mean the difference between coming home or being buried in foreign soil. The transport ship to England was a floating hell of seasickness and anxiety. James spent 17 days crossing the Atlantic, watching young soldiers barely out of high school vomit over rails and cry for their mothers in the dark. By the time they reached Southampton, he'd memorized the faces of every man in his artillery unit, wondering which ones wouldn't make it home. Training in the English countryside was brutal and constant. Captain Robert Thornton, their battery commander, was a West Point graduate from Connecticut who wore his privilege like a second uniform. He had thin lips, pale blue eyes, and a voice that could cut through artillery fire. During their third week, James noticed something critical during a practice drill. The way Thornton positioned their 105mm howitzers would leave them exposed to eastern light at dawn, making them perfect targets if the Germans attacked at sunrise. After the drill, James approached Thornton near the command tent. "Sir, about our gun placement." Thornton didn't look up from his maps. "What about it, Sergeant? The eastern position leaves us vulnerable at dawn. If we shift 30 degrees northwest, we'd have the sun at our backs during early morning operations. The enemy would be firing blind into the light." Now Thornton looked up, his expression cold. "And you determined this how exactly? Did you consult the artillery manual? The tactical positioning guidelines?" "I calculated the sun angle based on our latitude and the season, sir. It's basic astronomy combined with—" "Let me stop you right there," Thornton interrupted, standing to his full height. "I've heard about you. The Indian with the magic sun predictions. Well, Sergeant, we don't plan military operations based on tribal folklore and superstition." The other soldiers nearby went quiet, pretending to busy themselves with equipment while listening to every word. "It's not folklore, sir. It's mathematics. If you just look at—" "I said no." Thornton's voice rose sharply. "We position guns according to tested military doctrine, not because some savage thinks the Great Spirit told him where the sun goes." James felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "With respect, sir, my grandfather was tracking celestial movements while your ancestors were still figuring out the earth wasn't flat." Thornton's face went scarlet. "You're dismissed, Sergeant. And if I hear one more word about your sun calculator nonsense, I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination. We fight this war with American military science, not reservation witch-doctor garbage. Now get out of my sight." James saluted mechanically and walked away. His fists clenched so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. Behind him, he heard Thornton mutter to another officer, loud enough to be heard, "Pentagon should have never let these people wear the uniform." That night, James lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling while rain pounded the barracks roof. Tommy Redhorse sat on the edge of his bed. "He's gonna get men killed," Tommy said quietly. James said nothing, but both men knew it was true. And both knew there was nothing they could do about it. Not ye. The orders came down on a freezing February morning in 1944. They were being deployed to France, to a small village called Domfront near the German defensive lines. Intelligence reported 9 Panzer tanks operating in the region, part of a larger armored division that had been devastating Allied advances. Captain Thornton gathered the battery for briefing in a drafty barn that served as their temporary headquarters. Maps covered a wooden table, showing the rolling hills and dense forests surrounding their target position. "We'll establish our battery here." Thornton pointed to a valley position marked in red. "Standard defensive formation. The Panzers have been hitting supply convoys at dawn, so we need to be ready for early morning engagement." James studied the map from the back of the group, his mind automatically calculating angles. The valley position faced directly east. At dawn in early February at this latitude, the sun would rise almost directly in line with their gun sights. They'd be firing blind straight into the rising sun while the Panzers, approaching from the west, would have perfect visibility. It was a death sentence. "Sir," James spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmur of soldiers. That position. Not now, Sergeant, Thornton snapped without looking up. Sir, it's critical. The dawn sun will... I said not now. Thornton's voice was ice. This conversation is over. But the other men had heard enough of James's warnings over the past months. Corporal Eddie Martinez from Texas spoke up. Captain, maybe we should hear him out. His calculations have been... Thornton slammed his fist on the table. This battery will follow my orders, not the mystical visions of Sergeant Windtalker. We move at 0400 hours. Dismissed. The men filed out silently. Several caught James's eye with expressions that mixed sympathy with fear. They trusted him, but they trusted military hierarchy more. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat outside the barracks, watching stars well overhead, hearing his grandfather's voice in his memory, teaching him how the winter sun moved low and direct, how light could be both weapon and weakness. Tommy found him there at 0200 hours. You thinking what I'm thinking? James nodded slowly. If we set up in that valley, we're dead. All of us. So what do we do? James was quiet for a long moment, weighing everything. His career, his duty, the lives of 43 men in his battery. Then he made his decision. We follow orders. We set up where Thornton says. But when those Panzers come, when he realizes I was right, he'll have exactly one chance to listen to me. And if you believe in anything your grandfather taught you, you better pray he takes it. The two men sat in silence as the night slowly gave way to gray pre-dawn light. In a few hours, they'd find out if an Apache sergeant's band calculations could stand against 9 German Panzer tanks and 1 stubborn captain's pride. If you're hoping James finds a way to save his men, this would be a great moment to subscribe to the channel. The battle that changes everything is coming next. The battery reached the valley position at 0430 hours, darkness still thick as motor oil. The men worked fast, digging gun emplacements and positioning the 4 105mm howitzers exactly where Thornton had marked on his maps. James said nothing, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight with dread. By 0600 hours, the eastern horizon began to glow pale orange. James watched it like a condemned man watching the gallows being built. At 0617, the radio crackled. Contact. 9 Panzers approaching from the western ridge. Range 3,000 yards and closing. Thornton grabbed his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Load high explosive. Prepare to fire on my command. James moved to his gun crew, but his eyes kept tracking the horizon. The sun was rising fast now, a brilliant disk of fire climbing directly into their line of sight. In exactly 4 minutes, it would be positioned perfectly to blind every gunner in the battery. Range 2,000 yards, the spotter called out. Thornton raised his hand, ready to give the fire command. Through his binoculars, he tried to sight the lead Panzer, but suddenly he lowered them, blinking hard. The sun had crested the hills, blazing directly into his eyes with intensity that made tears stream down his face. I can't see them, someone shouted from gun position 2. Solar glare. The sun's right in our sights. Another voice called out. Panic creeping in. The radio erupted with German tank coordinates. But it didn't matter. Every man at every gun was firing blind, squinting uselessly into a wall of golden fire. Meanwhile, the Panzers kept advancing, their crews having perfect visibility with the sun at their backs. 1,500 yards. The Panzers would be in optimal firing range in 90 seconds. Thornton's face had gone white. He spun toward James, all his arrogance stripped away by raw terror. Windtalker, your son thing. Can you fix this? James felt time slow down. Every second of humiliation, every dismissal, every racial slur hung in the air between them. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. Pride is a luxury. Life is not. Northwest Ridge, James shouted, his voice carrying across the battery with absolute authority. Reposition all guns 30 degrees northwest. Now. Move, move, move. But sir, a corporal looked at Thornton, confused. Do what he says, Thornton screamed. Everyone follow Sergeant Windtalker's orders. The battery erupted into controlled chaos. 43 men abandoned their carefully dug positions and hauled the massive howitzers up the slope to the northwest ridge. James ran alongside them, shouting coordinates, adjusting angles with hand signals, calculating trajectories in his head, while his heart hammered against his ribs. 1,000 yards, the spotter's voice was shaking now. They crested the ridge with 30 seconds to spare. From this position, the sun blazed behind them, turning each howitzer crew into dark silhouettes, while the valley below lit up like a stage. The Panzers were fully exposed, their crews squinting up into impossible light. James raised his hand. Fire. The first volley screamed through the dawn air like vengeful thunder. For 105mm shells struck with devastating precision, 2 finding their marks on the lead Panzers. The explosions bloomed orange and black against the pale morning sky, metal shrieking as German steel crumpled like paper. Adjust fire. Left 2 degrees, James called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Second volley. Fire. The German crews scrambled desperately, trying to return fire while staring directly into the blinding sun. Their shots went wide, shells exploding harmlessly in empty fields. They were magnificent machines rendered useless by simple geometry and ancient knowledge. Third volley, James commanded. More explosions. A Panzer's turret flew 30 feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing into the earth. Another burst into flames, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment as crew members bailed out, hands raised in surrender. The remaining Panzers tried to retreat, their commanders finally understanding they were fighting a battle they couldn't win. But James had calculated their escape routes too, positioning his guns to cover every avenue with the sun as their constant ally. Fire at will, he ordered. For 8 minutes, the battery rained destruction on the German armor. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echo of artillery faded across the French countryside, all 9 Panzers sat burning or disabled in the valley below. Not a single American casualty. Not one. The men stood in stunned silence, staring at what they'd accomplished. Then Corporal Martinez let out a whoop that broke the spell, and suddenly the entire battery was cheering, slapping James on the back, lifting him onto their shoulders. Through the celebration, James saw Captain Thornton standing apart, his face unreadable. Their eyes met across the ridge. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Thornton walked over, the crowd parting to let him through. The captain stopped directly in front of James, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them both. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only James and the men immediately nearby could hear. "I was wrong," Thornton said simply, "about everything. Your calculator, your methods, your knowledge. You saved every life in this battery today, including mine. I owe you an apology that words can't adequately express." James studied the man who'd called him a savage, who'd dismissed his grandfather's wisdom as witch-doctor garbage. He saw genuine remorse in Thornton's eyes, the kind that comes from staring directly at your own failures. "Apology accepted, sir," James said. "But I didn't do this for an apology. I did it because these men deserve to go home." Thornton nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone watching. He saluted James, a gesture of respect between equals, not the perfunctory salute of rank. "When I write my after-action report," Thornton said, "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. And I'm personally delivering your sun angle calculations to General Bradley. No more bans. No more dismissals. This becomes standard doctrine." James returned the salute, feeling something tight in his chest finally loosen. His grandfather had been right all along. The old ways and the new ways didn't have to be enemies. Sometimes they just needed the right moment to prove they belonged together. Fort Huachuca, Arizona. September 1945. The war was over. James Windtalker stood in the same office where Colonel Harrison had confiscated his notebook 2 years earlier, but everything had changed. The walls now displayed commendations, photographs of artillery units, and prominently featured a framed document titled Solar Positioning in Artillery Operations, co-authored by Staff Sergeant James Windtalker and Captain Robert Thornton. Harrison, now a general, sat behind the same desk, older but wearing a genuine smile. Your methods are being taught at West Point now, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Every artillery officer in the Army learns sun angle calculation as part of their core training. They're calling it the Windtalker Protocol. James opened the folder. Inside were letters from commanders across Europe, testimonials about how his techniques had saved countless lives in dozens of battles after Domfront. There were newspaper clippings calling him a hero, though he'd never sought that title. The Pentagon wants you to stay on, Harrison continued. Train the next generation. You'd make captain within a year, major in 3. James looked out the window at the Arizona desert, at the mountains where his grandfather had taught him to read the sky. Thank you, sir. But I'm going home. Back to the reservation. There are young men there who need to know that their heritage isn't primitive or backwards, that the old knowledge has value. Harrison stood, extending his hand. Then let me say what I should have said 2 years ago. Thank you for your service. And I'm sorry it took a war for us to listen. 3 months later, James sat on the porch of a modest house on the Apache reservation, watching his 5-year-old nephew chase jackrabbits across the scrubland. Tommy Redhorse sat beside him, both men comfortable in the silence that came from shared survival. Uncle James, the boy called out, running up the steps. Grandfather says you won the war with the sun. Is that true? James smiled, pulling the boy onto his lap. I didn't win the war, little one. A lot of brave people did that together. But I did remember what our grandfathers taught us about respecting the sky and understanding how the world moves. And that knowledge helped keep soldiers safe. Can you teach me? James looked at Tommy, who nodded with a grin. Both men had already decided to start a school on the reservation, combining traditional Apache wisdom with modern science and mathematics. I can teach you, James said. But first you have to promise me something. You have to promise to never let anyone tell you that being Apache makes you less than anyone else. Our people have wisdom that goes back thousands of years. That's not something to hide. That's something to be proud of. The boy nodded solemnly, not fully understanding but sensing the weight of the words. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, James calculated its angle out of habit, a skill that had become as natural as breathing. But now he calculated for peace, for teaching, for a future where knowledge of all kinds would be valued. The war had taught him many things, but the most important lesson came from his grandfather's voice in his memory. True strength isn't about proving you're right. It's about using what you know to protect those who need it most. And that, James thought as he held his nephew close, was a lesson worth passing down through every generation to come. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If this tale of courage, wisdom, and redemption touched your heart, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us what you thought. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible true-to-life stories of unsung heroes who changed history. What kind of story would you like to see next? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, remember that sometimes the oldest wisdom holds the greatest power.